Hi everybody, it's Miss Corbett here. It's around 1:30 p.m. on Tuesday, August 25th. Welcome to our first class notes video. I'll be making these videos after each module, and I post them once I've reviewed and graded all the QDS work from the previous module. So I do the grading first, and then I put up this video. So that means that until you see a video posted, you'll know that the grading and reviewing is still in progress, that I'm still doing it. Once it's posted, I encourage you to review all your grades and enter them into the grade calculation spreadsheet, which you'll remember is in the Detectives Toolbox section of our course site. And remember, if you're entering your grades in there, here you go, that you want to be entering the points and not the percentages. Since everything we do each week can add up to 100 points, we want to focus on the points. My goal is always to get you these videos on Tuesdays, though occasionally, depending on the QDS work required in a certain module, they might come a little bit later. They might come on Wednesdays, but I will be getting them to you as soon as I finish the grading. My goal in these videos is to kind of go over what we did the previous week. I want to clarify points, add material. Depending on the work you've done the week before, I might offer more information, more details on something, and that information is fair game for quizzes and for the final exam. So you'll want to make sure you never miss one of these videos. They're also only available until the next module closes. So when module 2 closes, this video will disappear. So you don't want to wait to watch it either. They are also the main way I let you know about any potential extra credit opportunities if we have them. I will let you know about them in these videos. And then also I'll give you a peek forward to what's coming next in the next module, give you some tips for that. I'll talk about why we're doing it, what we're doing, and how it'll work. Some of the videos are going to be longer than others. This is going to be one of the longer ones simply because it's our first one and I have to go over some of that, this information, explaining why we did it, that kind of thing. But my goal will always be to keep them as concise as I'm able to. So let's get started with this video by talking about what we did in our first week together. 1 week down. So as you know, we start every module with the module overview. So let's look at that now. We started this first week with getting to know our course and our D2L site. You took the syllabus quiz, which was a way for you to demonstrate comprehension of the syllabus to show that you read it and understood it, and also a way for me to help kind of reiterate some of the most important points. A couple people had some questions about the answers to those quizzes where they thought that they were marked wrong when they shouldn't have been. If that's you, email me. Let me know where, why, what question it was, and why you think your answer should have been counted correct. And then I'll go back and review the quiz and I can clarify any issues, or on the rare occasion where the quiz made a mistake in the automatic grading, I can fix it. It doesn't happen often, but it does happen a couple times every semester. So if it happens to you, let me know. Then you watched this video on the birth of the genre. In it, we attempted to provide some brief historical context for the general consensus of where and how the detective story began as a genre. Knowing about the intellectual and cultural movements preceding the genre's development and other factors like the scientific innovations of the time can help us see that this genre didn't happen by accident, nor are its traits arbitrary. It, like all of literature, kind of like everything, is a product of its time. You got to see this in action when we read Edgar Allan Poe's short story, The Murders in the Rue Morgue. And you got to respond to those in this week's reading journal. I want to say a couple things about reading journals in general, and then I want to talk about this one in particular. So we're going to have a most weeks, and I want you to think of them as informal places to share your thoughts related to the prompt. In them, you can be conversational and honest. You don't have to love every text we read. So you're allowed to say you didn't like it. But it's not okay to dismiss any reading assignment. By that I mean we still need to engage with the material and address the prompts, even if we're not crazy about the reading. With these journals, be sure to follow directions. That is that you will be responding to one prompt only and going into detail on that one, and that you meet the minimum word count, which most weeks will be 300 words, though not every week. That's why you always want to come to the overview to see those specific requirements for that assignment. I read each of your responses carefully, but I typically don't comment on reading journals. I might if I want to add a point to something you said or clarify some misunderstanding or remind you of assignment requirements, but the majority of the time I'm not going to comment on them. I want these journals to be places for your voice on the text, not mine. So as long as your responses are relevant to the prompt and accurate to the text, there really aren't wrong answers. I'm asking for your thoughts on it. Please know, though, that I am absolutely reading every single one of these. I take notes on your responses, and then I address these points in these videos. So as I'm reading through your responses, I'm writing down, jotting notes, things to say, and then this is kind of the video where I bring it all together and respond to those points. I'll say that I really enjoyed reading your responses to the Poe story. You hit on a lot of points that I want to add to and emphasize here. First, a number of you, and let's just look at the story, that might be helpful. A number of you talked about the traits of the story that match with those we discussed in the video. For instance, the importance of analysis and intellect, how Dupin uses his reasoning and observational skills as a means of investigation. And I apologize when my computer's slow to load things, but it's getting there. It's chugging along. So yeah, you talked about his reasoning and his ratiocination, his intellect. We can see the effects of both the Enlightenment and Romanticism in his character. And that certainly contributed to his popularity at the time. During the Enlightenment, people really valued reason and logic. And even though the Enlightenment had ended decades before this story was written, Poe was still very much influenced by those values and people's faith in and respect for analytical abilities. People believed in those things still. That still remained. With Romanticism, we saw an increased focus on the individual, thus allowing for the kind of super detective who relied only on his own intellect to be very possible. You know, the most ordinary. He had an interest in the most ordinary details of everyday life, such as a nail or a window. And through that, his focus on those things, he was able to have this super intellect that would reach large conclusions that other people missed. A number of you also noted the use of the dumb friend as a method for relaying information. This trope is a practical one, really. We see it in movies and television as well. Writers need to give their characters someone to talk to, or else it would all be going on inside their heads. And if we're not getting access to that person's thoughts, we wouldn't know what they were discovering unless they have some reason to share their thoughts out loud. And in this case, if we were in Dupin's head, then a lot of the awesomeness of his intellect wouldn't surprise us, right? He would be walking us through the logical connections as he saw them. We would always know what he was thinking. There wouldn't be much mystery. We also noted the relative uselessness of the police. As you learned in the video, the whole idea of a police force was a pretty new invention at the time this story was written, at least the police force as we know it today. People were used to stories about heroes with great strength or intelligence, and so they tended to kind of put more faith in the power of the individual over the power of a group, particularly a group that was still in the process of figuring out what it was. That wasn't something that was as established culturally as it is to us today. It's a good reminder that views of the police and the role of law enforcement in both investigating crime and enforcing laws is a relatively new concept. And certainly it, as the focus for detective literature, is a very new concept when looked at in this context of history. I sometimes, after reading your journals, will point out somebody's individual points. And one of them that I wanted to talk about today is Ryan Griffin in section W01 brought up the question of justice for the victims, how this story doesn't focus on or provide justice for them. It doesn't even seem to see that as a very important thing. And I bring this up because I want us to continue to be thinking about this concept of justice as we're looking at future texts. Different cultures are going to interact with the question of how justice is defined differently. Obviously, we're just reading representative texts from a culture and time period. We're not going to ever be able to, in a class, read every text from a culture or time period. But we can learn a bit about how the culture defines justice through these texts, how they approach the idea. Despite what we may think, justice hasn't looked the same across all times and cultures. And our contemporary definitions of justice, the way we think of justice being served today, is heavily influenced by the culture around us. Another point that a number of you made that I wanted to talk about is that you noticed how gory and gruesome some of the details in this story were. Those of you who commented on the graphic and dark details as being true to Poe's style are certainly right. Absolutely. He was interested in darker stories, and those of us who have read his work before know that. So those things are accurate. He was interested in that stuff. But we also have to remember that Poe was a very popular writer. If this interest in darker stories weren't popular with readers, we wouldn't still be reading Poe today. So the gory details of his writing don't just tell us about him. They tell us about the time period and culture as well. Many people were surprised to see such gruesome details, like the neck snapping off, in a story that was published so long ago. And I understand why. When thinking about the way things used to be compared to how things are now, humans as a whole don't tend to think back very far, or at least we tend to forget some truths about more distant cultures and times. It is true that books, TVs, movies, etc. today are often more violent or graphic or sexually explicit than maybe, say, they would have been in the 1950s, which is why we might be surprised to see gruesome details in work from the 1840s. But history and the development of cultural values are not always a straight line. The Victorian age that took hold later in the 1800s was very focused on respectability. The idea of gruesome or gory details not being appropriate for certain audiences or even public consumption as a whole took hold during that time period. So when we think of older works as coming from a more buttoned up or proper time period, know that those stereotypes are largely a result of Victorian ideals and values. Those values simply weren't important, or not as important, when Poe was writing. Also, finally, some of us mentioned the similarities between Dupin and the most famous fictional detective of all time, Sherlock Holmes. You're absolutely right about those similarities. Sorry. You're absolutely right if you saw those. Like Dupin, Sherlock relies on logic and observation to solve crimes. He has almost superhuman intelligence, and he's got that dumb sidekick. Though Sherlock's Dr. Watson has more of first he has a name and a developed backstory. Both detectives are very much the product of the 1800s, when people trusted science and logic to triumph over the chaos and anxiety of the Industrial Revolution, and the feeling that evil was everywhere. Resulting from so much change. The Industrial Revolution brought so much change. And that's just a truth about humans that seems to be pretty consistent across time periods and cultures. Big changes, big cultural changes make us very anxious. So periods of great change bring with them widespread fear and panic, resulting sometimes in extreme and even violent views held by those who want to stop the changes and take everything back to the way it used to be. That mindset is very common in periods of great change. Those similarities are not just because we see them. In fact, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who wrote Sherlock Holmes, he admitted that Dupin was a huge influence on his detective. Sherlock's first story was published in 1887, more than 40 years after Dupin made his debut. So Conan Doyle and the detective genre as a whole was heavily influenced by Poe's stories. Though Sherlock was definitely more active than Dupin, his stories had more of a, quote, adventure tone to them. And I used the word adventure. I emphasize that word because that was part of the title of a lot of Sherlock stories, The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. But if you felt like Dupin was a little stereotypical or cliche, some of you noted that, because you've read or seen characters like him before, that's true. But note that he was the first. Those stereotypes, those cliches exist because of him. Sarah Mims in section W04 noted a feel or tone to this story that reminded her of other texts she had studied, like Frankenstein and the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, stories you might also be familiar with. And she's right in seeing those connections. Frankenstein was published roughly 2 decades before this story was published, and Jekyll and Hyde came out about 40 years later, give or take. So these writers would have been familiar with the publications that came before them. Poe would have read Frankenstein. That would have been part of his history. So again, we see the connectivity and influence of literary work. What was written before does influence what comes next. The work is never produced in a vacuum. And that's one of the main things we're going to be seeing this semester. If you liked this story, Dupin stars in 2 more Poe stories, The Mystery of Marie Roget and The Purloined Letter. I recommend checking those out. We did one other thing this week, and that was the discussion board, the introduction discussion board. We do that for a couple of reasons. I want us to get used to using the discussion boards because we'll be using them a lot. And it was a get to know you opportunity. I want to know a little bit about you, find things that you and I have in common, or things that I want to learn more about, or other people want to learn more about. Because even though we don't meet in person in a physical classroom, we are still a community here. And so I hope you'll take time to read even more of the intros and get to know each other even more. Because it was our first week and Drop Ad was ongoing, I did not take off points for initial posts that came after the Friday deadline. So if you posted after the Friday deadline, you could still get full credit this week only. In the future, you will lose points for posting after that deadline. But even so, remember that it's always better to post late than not at all. You always get some credit for posting, even if you post late. All right. I don't want to go on too much longer. I know this is, again, going to be one of the longer ones, and I'm sorry, but I appreciate you sticking with it. Let's talk real quick about what's coming up in Module 2. We are diving this week into the Golden Age. That's the first really defined period of the detective story. And it was also a period in which the detective story had quite a renaissance. You'll learn about the style and the time period. The term Golden Age refers to both. There's a Golden Age time period, and there's also a Golden Age style that can exist outside of the time period. And we'll start reading the novel, The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. You notice you have 99 pages to read this week. That's a lot, I know, but I do think the pages move pretty quickly. My best advice for tackling a long reading like that is to break it up into pieces. Don't sit down and expect to read 99 pages in one sitting. Read a few pages every day and you'll find it goes by pretty quickly. Also, I really recommend not Googling the book more than necessary if you need to find it to buy it or whatever it may be. But don't Google much more than that because you would likely stumble on the ending and the book's going to be a lot more enjoyable to you if you don't know how it ends. You'll have a reading quiz and video quiz that covers both the videos and the reading. And then we're going to do this time travel discussion board. A couple things about the discussion board. It is a small group discussion board. So that means you're only going to be able to see the post by other people in your group. So if you go there in a few days and you try to post and you see nobody else has posted, that just means you're the first one in your small group to post. You're also going to need to choose for this post, you're going to need to choose one of these scenes or chapters that I've identified here. Please make sure you identify which one you've chosen in your subject line. And remember that you have to choose a scene that no one else in your group has already discussed. So you want to make sure that you go look at the group first to see what other people have posted and then choose which one you're going to post. If you and somebody else post the same prompt within like an hour of each other, that's okay. I can forgive that. But make sure you're not just all doing the same one over and over again, because then we wouldn't have ones to respond to. So you'll do that posting by Friday night, and then your responses by Monday night, and you'll also have another reading journal. All right, as always, let me know if you have any questions. You can come to this Ask Miss Corbett discussion board if you have questions that you think other people in class might share as well. If it's more personal, related to your work or your grades, please email me. I'm excited for our semester together. I'm really excited to be working with you, and I can't wait to see you in Module 2. All right, bye.